All right, now then we are live. So we have other participant, the audience members who are listening us, the mainly doctoral students from our program. Hello everyone and welcome to this special webinar series. My name is Krishna Bista, Assistant Professor of Education at the University of Louisiana Monroe. And it's my it's my pleasure to introduce distinguished speaker who has done research and published articles in this field. So let me ask my guest speaker of the day to introduce herself. Please include your name, institution, and area of interest, and any other information or the fun facts that you like to share with our students.
Hi, so I'm Elaine Landy. Like you heard, I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm actually currently teaching in the math department. I taught math at the college level prior to pursuing my PhD, and I was frustrated with the educational system, which is why I came back to school and did my PhD actually in math education. But my dissertation did focus on teacher decision making, and it did focus on higher ed, but a lot of the research actually that I drew on was from elementary and secondary teaching. So I know a lot of you guys have a range of different interests. So there was a lot of things. I mean, dissertations are big projects. So in 45 minutes, I often find it more interesting to focus on some aspects that like you guys are most interested in. So I'd like to take just a minute for each of you to just briefly, you know, like 1 minute, like your background and what you're interested in, because then I can kind of pick out those pieces from my dissertation and that is going to be most appealing to you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and I don't know what order you want to do this in, but if you guys want to go ahead and just tell me a little bit about yourselves.
Okay, well, I'm Ashley Alexander. I'm from New Iberia, Louisiana. I'm currently a 6th grade ELA teacher, and I'm also an adjunct instructor at South Louisiana Community College. And I'm just willing to accept any advice you can give about the field of research.
All right, who would like to go the second?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm Amy, and I am currently just adjuncting at a university here in East Texas. My background is in special education. I'm kind of curious to know, how did you narrow down your topic? I know that's a big question, but that's kind of where I feel like a lot of our themes in our questions came. Was it from like a personal interest? You know, I'm looking at a STEM possibility because my daughter's currently attending a STEM elementary school, and I'm interested in that aspect of curriculum. So was it because of a problem that you saw that came up, or was it a personal interest? Like, how did you narrow it down?
Okay, anybody else? Or whoever's next, I should say.
Hello, I'm Jack. How you doing?
Hi, Jack.
Hey, I'm a associate professor of criminal justice at Northwestern State University, and I'm wondering about the generalizability of your study and results. Can it go beyond math? Can it go to the social sciences, to the performing arts, and just how far can this go? And I also find it fascinating that we learn that adjuncts talk to people versus full-time faculty who talk at people. That was to me.
Okay, thanks.
Next.
I can't quite hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. My name is Rebecca Wilson. I'm the assistant principal at a secondary high school in North Louisiana. and really brand new to this, and I'm very excited to just gain and glean anything I can from this conversation tonight to help me in my process of with whatever direction we go in. Obviously, data is really important to me. However, it's not valued in our district, and so not practically in paper, I guess it is, but they're not actually doing a whole lot, and so possibly going in something in that direction.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris.
My background is really more in science. I come from the biology, developmental genetics side of things. I'm really working as an environmental chemist right now. My concentration has always been higher education, but the problems that we see in higher education obviously their origins are K-12. One of the things that when I was reading through, I was struck by sample sizes, and I wondered if you might pick on how you arrived. Was it more what you could get for participation? Was it guided by reality? I mean, so much of what we always write up is just what was practical for the time, because you do have to stop at some point. So that was more my question is, at what point did you become comfortable of significance, but have, confidence in your group?
Okay. And who haven't we heard from yet?
Hi, my name is Andrew Price, and right now I'm a high school teacher. I teach ELA, social studies, and classics. I actually started out as an adjunct at the college level. I taught English for several years before going back, getting certified to teach secondary level. One of the things that I thought was interesting when I was reading through your research was that you take a really complex, contextual kind of environmental issue. And I'm really interested, how did you narrow down like the research model that you use, like your data collection model? How do you think that helped you reflect a very broad, kind of complicated issue, and how did that kind of shake out in the data, so to speak, when you were trying to narrow that down?
Okay. And let's see, is there anyone else we haven't heard from yet? Is that everyone? Okay. Okay, so good. So you guys are everybody's a PhD student here, correct?
All of them are doctoral students.
Doctoral students, okay.
It's an EDD program. It's more practitioner-oriented doctoral program, EDD.
Yes, okay, I got you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna go down, I was writing down your questions as we were talking about it. So I guess hearing your feedback, I'm assuming that everybody has read through the article and has some background on it. The one comment that I think is interesting, as you pointed out, is it's very complicated. How I actually got there, I have no idea. It happened. But one thing I did want to say about the research is this actually came out for very practical reasons. My advisor was doing professional development for trig teachers, and I was involved in doing the professional development, and we had done it for research purposes, but also to help the teachers. So I actually had this data available to me. Okay, so the sessions were recorded and everything, and then transcribed for the purposes of a different study. And I was in the end of my third year, beginning of the fourth year, and I had to do my dissertation. And my intention was actually to look at student understanding and remedial mathematics, but there was a practical problem there, and that was that there's not a whole lot of research on that, and there was nobody in my department that really could help me do that. And so rather than kind of jumping in a black hole and thinking, am I ever going to finish this? Will I ever get somewhere that I need to? I took the path of, I have this data. It's something that I am interested in and is connected to my deeper interests, but I have to be realistic that I need to finish a dissertation because I can't be a grad student forever. At the time, I was pregnant, and so also there's that reality of, okay, life has to go on. So even though I was involved in all this data collection, none of this data was actually collected for this purpose. The groups were specifically split up between adjunct faculty and full-time faculty, partially to see what difference existed between those two groups, but it actually didn't have anything to do with these obligations and decision-making. So I actually kind of, I pulled out of the data we had something that I was interested in looking at. So there's a big practical decision for what can you do in a reasonable amount of time, and of course you have to enjoy doing it too. But it was just a very practical decision for me. Pat Herbst, who is the one who has originally talked about these professional obligations, the individual, the student, the class, and the institution. He's also in math education, but at the secondary level, and he was in the department. And I had done a lot of his readings and was really fascinated by a lot of his work because it took a really practical stance on what's going on with teachers. Because I mean, a lot of times when you get into the research stuff, it's just like, why don't teachers just do this? Like, the research shows that this kind of teaching works. Why don't teachers do that? And in reality, it's just not that simple. So that's why I really like this approach of thinking of it as practical rationality, that we all have these reasons for making our decisions, and they come from a lot of different places. And he's also here at the University of Michigan, so he was able to be on my committee. So it was a nice match. And prior to coming into grad school, I was actually an adjunct at Wayne State University in a community college around here. That was after I did my master's degree. And I really loved what I was doing. But whenever students would get stuck and I'd want to talk to other instructors about how they were helping students with their, like when they get stuck on, I mean, we were doing basic math, or when they're getting stuck on solving, basic equations, I'd start talking with them, and it always seemed like what it came down to was, yeah, students don't do their homework. The students don't care. There's not really a whole lot that you can do with it. And being kind of submerged in that situation, and this was at multiple institutions and multiple people, it was kind of depressing to me, because it was like, well, if it's just the students that can't do anything, well, what's the point of me even getting up there and teaching if I'm stopped there? And so actually, in that case also, I experienced what it's like to be a part-time faculty member, where you're in this very odd position. It's like, they really need you to fill the classes, but then there's also, will you have something to teach next semester? What's going on with that? And I guess another piece of this is, when I was teaching at Wayne State, there was an Emerging Scholars program, which taught math in a very different way. And I saw that it was possible for students to learn math in a different way. But then when I got in the classroom, I didn't have the resources or the support to actually do those things. So that's where my interest in what I eventually wrote on was, it was very personal. It was, I wanted to do all these things that I knew would help the students, and I couldn't. I had to cover the material. They had to get through so much that I couldn't let them sit down and struggle with it and figure it out. So that's what's got me into school, and actually then you can kind of see the thread going through into what I finally decided to do for my dissertation. And feel free, as I'm talking, if you have questions, you can either type them in the box or jump right on in. I don't have to just sit here and talk at you the whole time. And I did notice, was it Amy, you're interested in STEM education? So a lot of my research, actually, I have looked into a lot of the STEM fields, and math is kind of sits in there kind of in an interesting way, because it's necessary for all those fields, but there's very few people who actually major in math. They just need the math to go into the science and engineering and technology fields. So a lot of the information from the STEM fields is very informative, but it's also different, which was something I was getting stuck into when I was trying to figure these things out for myself. But in terms of generalizability, well, and a sample size, I'll talk about these both at the same time. So my sample size, as you guys noticed, it was 20 participants, right? Which is a very small, like if you're talking about data-driven decision making, that's not a huge number. But part of my reason for doing that and keeping it small was the level of analysis that I was doing with the linguistics. It takes a lot of time and a lot of reading and really trying to figure out what people are saying as opposed to kind of putting your impressions on what they're saying. So basically, it was almost too big. Had it been any bigger, it wouldn't have been possible. It would have taken too long to do. So there was the practical limitation on the sample size. But also, my research, it was qualitative. I mean, I wound up using my qualitative findings and I put numbers on them so they seem quantitative. But with qualitative research, you're really focusing in on really listening to your participants and the people you're researching. Sometimes it's hard when you come in with a specific question and you say, I want to know X, Y, and Z. Is sometimes you can't necessarily get exactly that from your participants. Yet in this case, because it was an open discussion, I was actually able to look at this huge open discussion and see what they were saying about these things. So I knew I was going in and interested in the professional obligations, but I had my own expectations thinking about my experiences and what I thought, how the obligations would balance out. But actually in going in and doing the research, I left it completely open to see what are these participants saying about why they're making their decisions. And throughout the whole professional development, we weren't actually talking about decisions, right? So they weren't actually focused on making decisions. I was just focused on what they were saying they decided to do. So it's a different kind of data, where if you had big numbers, you wouldn't get to that level of detail. So in terms of generalizability, I would say it's generalizable to all subjects. It's going to show up in very different ways, though. Say for in the arts example, for example, I don't think teachers are going to be so worried about like covering the content that they're required to because the curriculum's going to look different. But there still may be an expected type of curriculum that's going to be covered. So I think the general obligations will hold like across disciplines, but this is just a speculation. This hasn't been looked at in this way outside of mathematics. I mean, I know people who teach other subjects, and when I talk to them, they kind of are like, yeah, this makes sense. At the Writing Center here, when I was doing my dissertation, they teach all the intro English classes. And as they're reading this dissertation, they're going, oh yeah, that's what I do. And I get stuck there. And so it resonates with other teachers that, you know, I mean, English and math are about as far apart as you can get. So there's no evidence that it's generalizable, but from my experience and what I hear from these teachers, I would say it is. The other thing about the sample, though, is for this professional development, we asked for teachers who basically their department chair thought were excellent teachers. So in that sense, our selection pool was those chosen by the chairs. So it's a very, I mean, in some ways you could look at that as a very biased sample. And in some ways that's problematic because those selected by the chair are probably more focused on the content in the students, at least I would suspect, rather than the institution. Whereas if somebody's, really struggling to teach and they're really trying to hold on to their job because they don't think people approve of it, those institutional obligations are going to be much more on the forefront. So in terms of how the obligations play out, I think it'll be very different for different populations. But in terms of the difference I found with the full-time and part-time faculty, with the part-time faculty being more tentative in that, given that these people were chosen by their chair, I would speculate that this group is actually less tentative than had you taken a different group of adjunct faculty. So could I write a research article saying that this is generalizable? No, I don't have the data to support it. But I can say from my experience and that of other people around is I see no reason why it wouldn't be generalizable. And it's interesting, Rebecca, that you mentioned that you're at a place that is very not data-driven. I would also, and I'm also kind of curious from you, what are you guys defining as data-driven decision-making? Like, how do you define that term?
Well, I feel like can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you can speak up a little bit, but I can hear you.
I feel like data-driven decision-making involves looking at baselines, looking at where are we going, what's happening here. And frequently, we're making these decisions that are just kind of pie in the sky, in my view, without any data showing this is the direction we go in. My district likes to throw money out, and about every 2 years, we have a whole different plan that's here. And it's really frustrating to me. And as an assistant principal, and soon, hopefully, I'll move to this principal position, I just want to take our school in a different direction. I want, even if the district's not on board with this, I would like for our school to be on board with this.
So that's an interesting aspect of data-driven. What data are you using to make decisions, right? And in research, there's, there's like the What Works warehouse that, there's requirements on, how strong the data suggests that these things help students learn. I guess this is a big caution that I have is, I never take data at face value. Is when you read, whether it's an article that says this method works for students, I have to be honest, there's some things in math education that I've completely disregarded. So there's some research, and they're mostly by psychologists, that basically say that the best way to learn math is just by doing basically drill and kill. And repeating it and seeing examples, right? And so these people, in order to show that this works, they do a study with randomly selected students, so it's like methodologically sound. With one set of students, they give them a bunch of problems to do with no instruction. And the other set of students, they show them several examples and then have them do the problems. Okay, well, think about that research. Of course, the students who see the examples are going to do better on the tests they give because they've seen some examples. So then they come to the conclusion that doing examples over and over again is going to help students learn. But I know from experience and from other research that, of course, it's going to help more than absolutely nothing, but is it the best thing that's going to work? So when you're talking about looking at benchmarks and seeing how to get to those benchmarks, there could be data in some way that actually says, yes, you should be doing that. But the real question is one that, sometimes you find really great research that really like clicks with you. And you say, yes, I see this happening, I see that happening, it works. But I always caution you to really question the research because yeah, the statistics are strong, they're great, they're publishable. Do they actually help us in practice in the classroom? As a professor, that kind of thing. And yet in education, we focus on how to take standardized tests instead of teaching content. Yes, and it's also for me, so I don't know how many of you guys actually know about the standard, what's the name of it? The core math principles that came out for Common Core standards that came out for math. And it's interesting because these were developed by researchers in the math education community. And in reading all that stuff, everything it's pushing is really great. But then as soon as those goals get disseminated and different people decide to get there in different ways, most of that stuff's falling flat on its face, right? They're missing other aspects that should be there. So you have these really knowledgeable people that have a lot of experience, and what they come out with is great, but how people actually use that and implement it is a totally different thing. So the people who wrote those, they wrote them so that students will get a deeper understanding of math. But then all of a sudden, the standardized tests are trying to test that, and the teachers are trying to teach the test, and you've lost the whole purpose of creating those in the first place. So I guess that's my caution of, even when you use things that are data-driven, is question them. Now, when you're using things that aren't data-driven, they're not necessarily bad. They're not necessarily good either. You just have no idea. And I mean, you guys are obviously interested in that. That actually becomes a researchable question. Our district is implementing this curriculum. And if you can somehow measure a baseline before you start that curriculum, and then, I mean, you said every 2 years they're trying something new, is after 2 years, take the same measurements somehow and see how things that have changed. The difficulty there then is deciding what measurements you actually want to take. Are they measuring what you're trying to get at, or what the curriculum is trying to do? So if the curriculum, say in math, is trying to get students really, really good at the computational skills, and what you're measuring is how well teachers are helping students deeply understand the math, there's a misalignment there. So, caution with that. But the other thing you say about switching curriculum so often is, I'm teaching Calc 1 here at U of M this semester. It's my first time teaching at U of M, which is a very different population of students, and it's my first time teaching calculus. I have the math background to do it. I have the experience with students to do it. Jumping into this the last 2-3 weeks have been absolutely insane for me. It's completely different. And if somebody were to come into my classroom right now and watch me teach, and I've done observations of hundreds of these classes, I'm thinking these classes are a mess. I mean, they're still about average. I'm not doing anything wrong, but they don't look like what I want them to look like. And here's where the practical rationality comes in. Luckily they're small classes. I've got 20 students in front of me. From a research perspective, I could sit in the back of the room and see how all those students were doing. Were they paying attention? Were they understanding this and that? As soon as I get in the front of the room, I have to start tuning that stuff out because it's too much of a cognitive load. I can't be paying attention to every single student and not be paying attention to this. So for me, this is like a new curriculum for me, with new students, with new material. Like I've said, I've seen hundreds of these classes taught, so it's not a mystery to me, but it's still a new curriculum for me. And I would say this first semester, if I were to evaluate my use of this curriculum, I probably wouldn't be happy with it. But if I continue teaching this for another year or two, I really believe in the curriculum here. I think it's a great curriculum, and I get really good at it, I can see it becoming more effective. So there's also that teacher, both the buy-in, but also just getting a feel for what's going on. So it might also even be a push for, if we're going to try something, we need to have a reason for trying it. And unless something, you're harming the students, stick with it and see what happens. Because honestly, if every 2 years I had to teach new math classes, I'd be constantly on the learning curve, as opposed to getting in that groove of, okay, I'm really comfortable with the content and I know where this class is going. And then once I do that, I start seeing where the students' misconceptions come in. I can integrate that in, right? And you can see over semesters, it's a time and it's a process thing, which is difficult when school districts are saying, okay, here, let's try something new. Let's try something new, is the teachers aren't able to settle into that. So I don't know if you have anything else, Rebecca, with that you're curious about, but sometimes I don't think they necessarily need to be data-driven. But then I think you can use your own data, and as you notice from my research, it was qualitative. I mean, you learn so much from talking to teachers and not asking them specific questions, but just letting them talk to you by like asking really open-ended questions. Like, how is this curriculum working for you? What's working great? What's not working good? What are the difficulties? What are the challenges? And whatever they say that's great data. It's not data that you're necessarily going to get nice p-values for, which actually I was really surprised came out of my research. I didn't expect any of this stuff to be statistically significant with such a small sample size. I mean, the fact that it did kind of blew me away. Is how you gather that data and what data you use is I think a key piece of all of this. And then back to, was it Andrew's question about how I narrowed down such a complicated issue? Basically, I had this data, and I had this idea of practical rationality that I liked. And so then it came down to, how can I look at these things together? As I started doing that, my initial focus was just looking at their decisions and why they were making them and classifying them. The more complex layers that go on top of that, some of the stuff that was actually in that article wasn't in the dissertation. It was kind of like after I defended my dissertation and had conversations with the people on my committee and with my advisor, it was like there was stuff that kind of extended it. It didn't come directly from the data, but this idea of like the individual and the social context. That was kind of a new idea that wasn't very prominent in my dissertation, but it's something that I really see that came out of it. So a lot of the complexity you see in there, it's not something that I initially went in expecting to find or anything like that. It was, as it evolved and as I really got immersed in the data, I started seeing those things. And at some points it got so complex that I had to put it aside and say, I can't look at that stuff. I need to come back and focus on this piece or that piece. Because it does get that tendency to kind of get unwieldy. And it was really nice with my advisor. She was really good. Sometimes she'd let me go, but sometimes it would get off track and she'd bring me back to, okay, you're focusing on these professional obligations. How does that connect to there? And sometimes it did, and I kept going. And sometimes it was like, yeah, that's going off on a different track. Save that for when I finish my PhD. I'll think about that later. So in some sense, it wasn't so much narrowing down a complicated issue. It was really digging into the issue until I understood the complexities of it. So I have very interactive classrooms, so doing this online is kind of weird for me. So based on everything I said, do you guys have questions, comments, things you want me to talk a little more about?
Yeah, guys, maybe you can type up your questions there in the chat box, so that will help you remember some of the questions and be interactive. Maybe, if you have a follow-up questions, anything, you can ask anytime.
Oh, and I guess I do have one other question. So a few of you guys mentioned that you were adjuncting, you were an adjunct at different points at different colleges. I'm just curious if my research resonated with you. Is that something that you saw, or was it a very different experience?
Yeah. When I was teaching English, we would always teach at different levels. I assume it's probably the same for math faculty. For you, that certain classes are generally reserved for full-time faculty or faculty that have their first picks over it. And of course, that's the same way literature surveys tend to go to people that are, either tenured or full-time. So most of us were teaching comp, like basic English composition and whatnot. And talking with some of the people, because I taught full-time and then I taught adjunct at a community college. So I could definitely tell a difference there, because we are really preparing students, for the next level. But the next level are instructors and professors that are more highly vested into the department. They've been there a lot longer. Their course load is, less chaotic. It changes, more infrequently. So we always looked at it as it was our job to basically take students that may or may not still have remedial requirements and somehow prep them for full-time faculty members without having an actual office, without having access to curriculum materials, not having a copier, not being able to come in for these curriculum meetings over the summer. So we're kind of handed down a curriculum and said, this is what we expect you to do, now deliver. And so I can definitely say that when you look at, like you said, those institutional objectives and whatnot, when you're worried about not getting that call back the next semester to see if classes make or not, you're definitely going to focus on meeting certain requirements and whatnot, than kind of being more vested in the material. And because I noticed how you mentioned that the full-time faculty members taught more about what they do, what they tend to do, versus the adjunct talks about how they would react to a certain situation. And I can definitely say that's how I was. I always felt like I was constantly problem solving. Whether I taught it for 5 or 6 years was irrelevant. It was that I never knew how I would teach it or what would be expected of me. So I can see that for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting for those of you who are at the K through 12 level. So I don't know. In Michigan, there's not really any such thing as adjunct K-12 teachers. I don't know that that's the case anywhere. They're mostly full-time teachers. But where I think a similar divide would happen is, and I guess it varies by school district too, is how new they are to the system and how secure they are in their position. Like some schools have, your first 5 years are yearly contracts, and then if you, go through and, certain people, check the boxes and say, yes, you're doing a good job, then you're kind of more in a tenured-like position. Whereas also with charter schools and other things, sometimes this whole notion of security is gone, which I think the same difference that is seen in the full-time and part-time faculty in higher ed would also likely show up in K-12, obviously with different divides among the teachers.
So I have a question just about demographics. I was thinking in reflecting on my own teaching experience, what the full-time faculty in my university structure is much older. They've been there a long time. There's a huge dichotomy between the instructors and the adjuncts that are teaching. They're very young. I would think that their average age is 30 to 35, whereas the full-time faculty their average age has to be at least 65. There's a huge difference in like technology comfort and plasticity maybe. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if you thought in reflecting on your study now to those institutions that are a little bit more, I hate to use any other word, but stagnant in some of their tenure progression, what you thought, because I didn't get really a feel for some of those demographics when I was reading your information.
Right, so it's interesting. So the
guys, let me interrupt you here. Looks like we have a background noise and some echoes. It could be because you might have opened your Moodle page. If you have opened your Moodle page, we have a live session going on there, and that may interrupt you. So for those who are in the class, if you have your Moodle page open, please close it. So we'll reduce, that will help us to reduce background noise. All right, sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. Yeah, so it's interesting, and this was actually like 5 or so years ago. I was looking at this, is the percentage of what was community college faculty, but I think it goes beyond that are going to be retiring, well, in the last 10 to the next 10 years is huge, which it's an interesting turnover, because that can, depending on the specific situation, that can be a really good thing, or it can be a really unstabilizing thing. And I don't know, it makes me think too of the, I think it was Rebecca who said every 2 years they're doing a new curriculum. In that case, even if you're there for 30 years and you're getting new curriculum thrown at you, it's almost like you're not in that old stable position. So in this sample, there was actually 2 of the participants were chairs who had taught, it was definitely over 15 years. One of them was definitely much more dynamic and, I don't know, more into the interactive education as opposed to the more traditional lecture at them and hope they absorb it or pay attention to it. And even in the adjuncts, some of them had been teaching a long time. I mean, some of them had been adjuncting for 15 years. 1 or 2 of them, I think, were retired K-12 teachers. So the one community college that I worked at, I actually wound up working with a lot of my high school math teachers because it used to be part of the school district. So a lot of the high school math teachers were adjuncts in the evening at the college. So the divide was different there. Did adjuncts work in their professions or were they just professors? Just wonder how having their feet in the field versus only teaching plays into this. Yeah, I just kind of answered that. But no, it's interesting because there was some participants who had other jobs and they were stable in their jobs. So they weren't so worried if they had a class to teach next semester. Because if they didn't get that adjunct position, it didn't matter. One of them was an engineer. They had that job. And I could also see, and the sample, of course, was 1 or 2 people, so I couldn't make any conclusions on this, is that I think made a difference in their decisions. Because there was also people who taught at multiple colleges, and every semester, they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And they're much more focused on what does the chair want me to do? What will make me desirable by this college, as opposed to necessarily what do I think is in the best interest of these students?
Well, I was just going to say, okay, that's me. My husband is a full-time faculty member, but he also is a practicing psychologist. And students, am I still okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. Students appreciate the fact that he can give them live, experience information, not just what the textbook says. And so I just wonder how you think that, and you just spoke to this, but like, does the fact that he's in his field as well as teaching, do you think that plays into the fact that we can better converse with students versus if all you ever do is teach or all you ever do is read a textbook?
Right.
You're going to be more likely to say, I can tell you what the textbook says.
Right, and that's 2. I mean, if you're a full-time professor, teacher, or whatever, you don't necessarily have that experience to build on that. In math, it's a little different because occasionally you get engineers teaching, but if they're teaching the remedial level math, there's not a whole lot of connections that can be made. If you're actually an engineer and you're teaching calculus, right, there's a lot of things they can say, oh yeah, I use this here and there. But I can see, I mean, thinking about when I took intro psych, I would have loved to have somebody who actually had experience as opposed to had this very narrow, I've read all this, the research says this. It's like, what else is out there? And this is actually an argument that I've heard for why colleges want adjunct faculty, is because they value, especially in the trades. So if you're doing, whether it's, electricians or heating and cooling and that kind of stuff, is those people who are in the trades have more experience and have more input to give the students than somebody who just knows the material that they have to learn. But then when you get into the very, classical studies, that argument doesn't hold quite so well. Because there's actually a very small number of adjuncts in math that connect it to whatever they do in the real world. So I think it varies a lot by the subject matter. And yeah, I would love to have a social studies teacher who's actually traveled the world. They can actually tell me about these things. as opposed to reading.
This is Jack, and just let me confirm what you're saying is correct, because I spent almost 20 years teaching in adjunct capacity as a working professional before going to the full-time ranks of professor. And there was a different dynamic between those of us teaching adjunct who were practitioners and what we call the read-onlys, those who have only read it and not done it. And I think there is an ability to connect with the students that the others don't have. And then another thing that emerged at one community college I was with for an extended period of time, they received a grant and they wanted to bring the adjuncts into more of a academic professional role in the assessment of the curriculum and the measurement of objectives. And it quit being fun to teach there as an adjunct because you were spending more time satisfying the non-classroom elements of the teaching responsibilities than you were the other, and the paycheck was exactly the same.
Right, and that's something that that when you read research on adjunct faculty is they're really looked down on, like they don't have as much contact with students. If you're not paying people to have office hours like you are the full-time people, of course you're going to find those answers. Yes, there are those who happen to have time and are able to put the extra time out for those students, but if you're not getting paid for it and you need to make a living, they have to balance that sometimes.
Well, again, one advantage that the adjuncts have too with the students that the full-time faculty don't have, unless they want to be a faculty member, the adjunct is a potential employer.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. So for those of you at the K-12 level, I guess, do you see any of this playing out as well, or does it just seem like a completely different system? And this is also kind of curiosity to me, and this goes to the generalizability of, the findings of this.
I mean, I think that the concept of like a stable versus an unstable job in K through 12, all of us pretty much know that unless there's some kind of systemic layoffs that are required, we have a position from year to year. I think more of the divide that I see is between people who have had more experience at the site level. I mean, we've got 20 or 30-year veteran teachers that are new to our school that feel like they are less, vested or even vetted in the department because they're new there, that they're not as established.
Right.
And, whenever you're scheduling, it's not the same at the K through 12 level as it is at a community college or, university, where you just count up the number of sections you need and try to, have them available different parts of the day. It's very more tightly controlled. So I think I see that more often depending on how vetted a person feels within the department. We've recently started doing these like PLCs, positive learning communities, where we establish like baselines for separate objectives within our department and grade level. And they'll put us into these groups and subgroups to basically implement these things and take a look at them and decide where we want to go next, set our own benchmarks for upcoming standards and whatnot. And you always see that divide between people who basically fold their arms and either say, well, I've been here for forever, I know it works, so I don't want to do this, versus younger people who tend to either, fall into one of two camps. We either get really, really excited and we want to take a leadership position, or we remain completely silent, wait for somebody else to take the lead.
Yeah.
The context, the specific decisions that are made, I'm sure, are slightly different, but when it comes to trying to come together as a department, those institutional, contextual, environmental factors are always, I think, going to play a part in that. So when I was reading through your article, like I looked at that and I started to think, to myself, like, how does this apply to a secondary school level? Especially being being a member of the faculty that teaches Latin, which isn't exactly, useful anymore. Trying to set baselines for that and talk about how that meets some of these larger institutional obligations for data reporting, for pupil progression, stuff like that. Depending on your role within an institution, I definitely think that you can see that. Maybe not in the same divide, but a divide is definitely present.
Right, and it's interesting here too, I guess I haven't really made this explicit either, is when we're talking about decision making, there's two levels here, right? There's the decisions that the teachers make in their classroom, but there's also the decisions that the administrators make, which of course in some way or another has a trickle-down effect on those decisions that the teachers make, right? So if you're implementing a new curriculum and the teacher is in an unstable position and really wants to satisfy the department or the principal or whatever, they're going to be more focused on working with that curriculum than somebody else who's just saying, yeah, we change this every 2 years. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. Or I'm just going to do what they say even though I know it doesn't work. So there's this interaction between those different levels. And then there's also the interactions of decisions made at the school district level that they're telling the principals, which is going to affect what the principals are doing. And it just keeps going. And it's nothing that you can ever like pull apart exactly and say, yes, if you make this decision, this is going to happen at the district level, the principal level, and the classroom level. You never know what's going to happen with it, but you can collect that information by, talking to teachers, hearing feedback from students, that kind of thing.
Do we have more questions? I think, Ashley, you have a question there. Ashley?
I'm here.
Okay, do you have a questions? I think one of your questions is still interesting. The one you were thinking of asking, I think I do have here. The one piece of advice that you would give to individuals who are learning to be researchers.
Right, and this was one of my questions because I feel like one of my classmates mentioned before, like, how do you even get started? I'm at a point where I'm close to graduation, like maybe within a year, and I have ideas about what I want to do, but then I'm like, the field is just so broad that I don't know, should I focus on a community college level where I'm an adjunct, or should I focus, 6th grade full time? It's just so many different questions. It's almost like I'm researching my own self to figure out where I want to go with my dissertation.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because going into grad school, people said, what are you interested in? And it was like math, remedial students at the college level, and their level of understanding. And to me, that seemed really specific. And as I started learning more and more and more, like as you really get into the research, that becomes a broad topic. So no matter how specific you think something is, I mean, depending on what's out there, there's so much within it. So yeah, it's having to choose. And I mean, quite honestly, when I started my dissertation, it was this isn't really what I want to be working on right now, but it's going to be, I can see it actually happening. And once I got into it, I found it really interesting and finding interesting things. So obviously you don't want to pick something that you're not interested in, but at the same time is choosing something that is practical. And that could even be like if you're interested at, the community college level, but the community colleges around you, the departments are very, like, I don't know, they don't want to talk. They're very, we do what we do. We don't want to, there's departments that are very skeptical of researchers, right? That can be a limiting factor. Fortunately, my advisor has a great relationship with a lot of the community colleges around here, which isn't the case with all researchers. So in narrowing down what you want to do, there's that practicality of it. Do you have access to that population that you want to research, right? And like for adjunct faculty, for those that are jumping around between jobs, if you have a grant or something that can actually pay them, it becomes a very, I don't know, lucrative place because they're getting paid for getting what you need. And then when it's on volunteer basis, of course, it's a little harder. So in you narrowing down and deciding is, make sure it's something you're interested in, but think about the practicality behind it. Do you have a principal or a teacher that's willing to participate with you? Do you have the data? Those kind of things. Did that answer your question? There's no good answer.
Yes, it definitely did. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a little follow-up. You were mentioning several times, implementation of reforms and things like that. And one of the things that always crosses my mind, I think it's because of the nature of the work that I do right now, is, sample size you mentioned earlier, 20, which I think I should have framed differently, because 20 in the type of study that you do sort of scares the hell out of me because of the extensiveness of what you have to do. Whereas, in some of my side projects, 20,000 data points would feel weak. So one of the things that I keep crossing my mind every time I read these studies is, the idea of p values and that significance that we want, but having the true controls. I mean, they are students. There is an ethical boundary at which you can't affect their future. That's one of the things I was interested in when I was reading about the dynamicness of these adjuncts was, well, when we're looking between separate adjunct sections or separate adjunct instructors, are they really our control to something? It's much more dynamic.
Right. And I mean, an issue I struggle with all over the place in life is depth versus breadth, right? Do you want to be able to say something that's true for, all second graders in this nation? Or is there one thing that you want to really dig into and really understand what's going on? And it's also, depending on the funding, you may have to do, big projects. But even if you're doing these big projects, is taking a little piece of that and really digging into, because sometimes what you find is you're asking the wrong questions, right? You're asking the questions that don't really answer our students' learning, right? Can students perform on standardized tests? We take that as if they can, then they're learning. And if they can't, they're not learning. But in reality, I'm sure they're learning something. It's a question of what are they learning? So yeah, that's one of those kind of conundrums.
So in considering the whole framework that you have, if you're going forward with this research, what's your next thing? What's your next process?
My next process, I have to be honest. So I finished back in, it was about 2 years ago now. And my focus right now has been, I need a job because I need healthcare and food for my family. So it's kind of interesting being invited to this, because it's like, oh yeah, I did that. And I've been scrambling around doing other things to make ends meet. So when you ask me those questions, it's like, thinking, of course, when I was doing this, everybody was asking me, what are your next steps, this and that, and I was all in it. And right now it's like, well, I guess if I want to think about that, it would be finding a tenure track position around here that would support me in actually doing that work, right? So there's the practical part on my end. But for me, it would actually probably be going in more detail, is seeing what happens in the classroom. So these are all the stuff that I did research on is what teachers said they did. I have no idea what actually happens in the classroom, right? So I know from doing a lot of observations is being full-time or part-time faculty, when you do the classroom observations, you could never guess who's part-time and who's full-time. There's phenomenal part-time faculty out there. There's miserable part-time faculty out there. The same is true for the full-time faculty. So my interest wouldn't be so much in that divide and what goes on in the classroom, but what's going on in the classroom, when it's working or not. What are the reasons the teachers are doing that? What are the kind of, where would we have to hit to talk to get teachers to change things if things aren't working? What obligation do they feel they're fulfilling? That kind of thing.
Guys, I'm sorry to say that, but we have reached to the top of the hour, and I would like to thank everyone for sparing the time and joining us today. And as importantly, I would like to sincerely thanks to my guest and the doctoral student, and then online audience who are joining us and asking some questions. Thank you so much.
And I also want to thank you guys. This is actually something that it's bringing me, it's been good for me. It's a big change from what I've been doing, but it was very enjoyable. So thank you.